With Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
The toll that war has taken on the human species is probably incalculable. But as historian Margaret MacMillan argues in her new book, what it has given us and how it has forged humanity since the beginning of time should not be underestimated. She's with us to explain tonight. Then, is it time for Canada to leave so-called Pearsonian diplomacy behind and take a more robust and aggressive approach to the rest of the world? We'll debate that. It's Thursday, October 15th, and that's next on the agenda. What if the horrors of war, carnage, destruction, chaos, and the sheer inhumanity of mass slaughter turn out to be fundamental to who we are as a species? A grim thought indeed, but historian Margaret MacMillan puts forward that thesis in her new book. It's called War: How Conflict Shaped Us. She is a professor of history at the University of Toronto and at Oxford, and it's there in the UK where we find her tonight. Professor MacMillan, it's so good to see you again, admittedly on the other side of the pond as opposed to over here, which I always prefer. But just tell us off the top, how are you managing through this pandemic?
Well, like everyone else, I had great plans when lockdown started. I thought I was going to read lots of great books and tidy up my drawers and do all that sort of stuff. And I find, I'm managing, but it's gets wearing after a while. How about you?
Well, I hear you. Same kind of thing. It's, we all miss people, right? I miss not having you here in the studio to do this, something like that, for sure.
Yeah. No, I mean, we get used to it, but it's not the same as seeing someone face to face.
No question. I want to start with something that you write in the book. You start the book actually this way. You say, we do not take war as seriously as it deserves, which is a funny thing to say because there's nothing in life more serious than going to war. So what do you mean by that?
Well, I think we tend to not to want to look at war because we think it's awful, which it is, and we worry that we might have another one, and perhaps we do. And I think we feel perhaps if you study war, it means you want it to happen. And I don't think that's true at all. I think my own view is that we need to understand war because it's so deeply woven into human society and into human history that it's very much a part of what we are and what we've become and what we might be in the future.
And what do you see as the consequence of not taking war as seriously as we should?
Well, if we don't understand war, then we won't understand how it starts, how it gets out of control often of those who start it, and how difficult it is to end. And then also what you do once the war is over, how you do the reconciliation and the rebuilding that's needed. And so if we don't understand war, I think we will probably fail to understand peace, because peace isn't just an absence of war. Peace is something that has to be built and has to be maintained. And so I think it's very important for us to understand the ferocity, the power, and the danger of war.
Many years ago, you told an educational consultant whose job it was to, to brand classes in a more appealing way so that more students would want to take them. You told this person that you wanted to teach a course on war, and the response was kind of intriguing. What did this person say?
I want to teach a course on war and society and how the two intertwine. And he said, I think you'd probably get more students wanting to take it if you called it peace studies. And actually, I don't think he was right. I think the students were interested in war, and not because they wanted to fight one, but just because they saw it as something which often they and their parents had experienced directly. Because where I was teaching at Ryerson, there were a lot of students who'd recently arrived in Canada from countries like Vietnam that had been at war. And so I found that students actually were curious about what causes wars, what makes wars, how wars are fought. And it's something I think we all need to think a bit about.
Did that little piece of advice, was it emblematic of kind of the bigger issue you're trying to convince people of here, namely to focus on war? Let's take it more seriously.
I think so. And I think sometimes in the universities there's been a sense that war studies are all about battles and weapons and tactics and strategy. And I don't think that's what it is at all. I think there is certainly military history, but what I'm thinking of is the history of war, which is as important to humanity as the history of trade, the history of industrialization, the history of science, the history of human movements across the globe. It is one of those forces which, for better or worse, has shaped the world in which we live, and really has had a huge impact on history.
Well, that was one of the neat things I found about the book, was that it's not just places and dates and so on and so forth. It really is a more philosophical look from 30,000 feet at this phenomenon that has so shaped us. Having said that, I am now going to hit you with a name and a date. We are going to go back to September 1792, battle in Valmy, France, between the why did I say it that way? France, between the ill-equipped French and the powerful Prussians. And you tell us a revolutionary form of warfare was born on that day. What was it?
What it was the difference between the two types of soldiers who were fighting. And the Prussian forces were very much the old style of the 18th century soldiers, highly disciplined. I mean, it often took 5 or 6 or even more years to turn them into the sort of disciplined soldiers who would do exactly what they were told. And they fought in a very predictable way. They fought in very neat lines. It was very standardized. And they found themselves up against French revolutionary soldiers, because by this point there'd been a revolution in France and there was a new sort of government and a new sort of feeling afoot in France. And the French revolutionary soldiers weren't trained, weren't disciplined, and didn't behave in predictable ways. They didn't march neatly onto the battlefield. They came streaming on, often singing revolutionary songs, shouting "Vive la République, Vive la France." And they streamed across the field, apparently not worried about dying in the cause. And this actually stunned the soldiers on the other side and the generals on the other side, because they hadn't seen soldiers who fought like this. A lot of them found it horrific. And in the end, it wasn't a great victory, in fact, for the French revolutionary soldiers, but it was important enough that they had held off this highly professional army. And I think something new was being born there. That Goethe, who was a very young poet at that point, was there, and he said something new has come about. And I think what we began to get was people fighting for a cause. And it had happened before in history with religion, but this time they were fighting for the nation and fighting for the revolution. And it did make them formidable, because they didn't understand they weren't meant to take risks. They were prepared to die for a cause, and that made them very difficult to fight.
In which case, the emergence of this nationalism, which you point to that place and that time as emerging in some respects for the first time, what do you think it meant for future wars going forward?
Well, what it meant, I think, in the 19th century was, as you got more and more nationalisms developing, it meant that you got a new kind of relationship between the country and the individual living in it. Before the French Revolution, people were subjects of the ruler, and that was true pretty much across Europe, although you had some countries like Sweden and England where people felt more as if they belonged to, they owned their own government. But what happened as a result of the French Revolution and the growth of nationalism is people felt they were part of something called the nation. It was something bigger than them. It had existed before them. It would exist after them. And it was in a way a cause. But they also had a different relationship to their own governments. If you vote for a government, then you, in a sense, own it. But you also have an obligation to it. You need to come to its defense and to the defense of the country if it's at war. And so what we got, I think, in the 19th century was the spread of a very different sort of motivation for going to war, and among those who actually were going to fight it.
Let me pluck a quote out of the book here, and this will take everybody back here to basically the turn of the 19th century into the 20th. V.W. Herbert, you quote him in the book. This is a British military journal, and here's the quote. "Is not war the grand scheme of nature by which degenerate, weak, or otherwise harmful states are eliminated from the concerted action of civilized nations and assimilated to those who are strong, vital, and beneficial in their influences?" I mean, this is really might makes right at its most basic. How long did this type of thinking go on for?
Well, I think it went on for quite a long time, and I find it absolutely horrific. This idea that war is somehow a purifying and a cleansing thing. It's very much influenced by the thought of Charles Darwin, although I think he would not have approved of the way in which it was applied to human societies. The idea that there was a struggle for survival, and the fittest, those who were ready to struggle, those who were most adapted to their environment, would survive. And so there was almost a moral thing that if you failed to survive, well, then you were probably weak and degenerate and should disappear anyway. And it was something that helped to fuel the European expansion of the 19th century into places like Africa, a sense that they were somehow a superior race. I think it's appalling, but I think we need to understand it, because it was a very powerful motivating force, and it wasn't just confined to a few intellectuals in universities. A lot of people felt this, and a lot of people talked in terms of their nation, or as they often called it, their race. as though the English race was superior to the French race and therefore deserved to do better and deserved to conquer and survive, or the German race was better than the French race, or the Russian race was better than the German race. I mean, this was the language of the time, and you can see where it would lead, and it did lead to often ferocious wars.
Well, let's continue to fast forward, and we don't have to go too far forward to get to World War I, where up until then, I gather some in society were worried that society was looking a bit too soft on the eve of World War I. Can you help us better understand what that meant?
Well, it's tied in, I think, with this idea that those that struggle for survival are going to survive, and those that aren't prepared to struggle for their survival deserve to go to the wall and in fact, deserve to disappear from the face of the earth or be assimilated by someone else. And there was a worry among a lot of European elites that the younger generation, I suppose this always happens, but the younger generation were getting soft. Too many people were living in cities. There was a sense that people who lived in cities were weaker and weren't as tough as those who lived in the countryside, in the healthy outdoors and so on. And I think there was a fear of degeneration. There was a very popular book, actually, called Degeneration, written in the late 1890s, which went into many editions and sort of had very alarmist things about how a group, a nation, or a race, because they often use the terms interchangeably, would get degenerate and its people would not be capable of fighting and the women wouldn't have enough children. I mean, this is a fear that runs through a lot of the late 19th century. And there were those who said a war would be a good thing. It would be like a tonic. It would perk people up and it would make them less selfish. I mean, I find this sort of thinking appalling, but we have to understand that it was actually quite influential at the time.
Well, let me follow that up with another conundrum that the following quote from your book raises. And here we go. Sheldon, if you would, let's bring up this quote. Many veterans also look back nostalgically to that comradeship and the ways in which life was simpler, with fewer alternatives or choices. And some miss the excitement. Quote, probably he would never look down on the lines again, wrote a British pilot after the First World War. Never search the sky for Huns, never fire his guns at a living target, never hear the infernal staccato behind him, never see tracers come up from the ground. All that was over and past. Never more the dawn patrol and the hard-boiled egg. Never more the terrific binges and the inimitable comradeship. Never more the frantic excitement and the ghastly fear. All that was over and life was empty. I find that so fascinating because, I mean, World War I was just, it was never-ending mud and blood and carnage and at the end of the day, so useless. How does someone look back at all of that and miss it?
It's one of the great paradoxes of war, and I think it's very difficult for those of us who've never been in a war to understand that there is an exhilaration, or there can be an exhilaration being in war, and there can be a comradeship. I mean, what comes out of, the First World War, we think of the mud and the horror and the trenches, but a lot of those who were there saw it in a different way and wrote about it in a different way. And what they do talk about is the comradeship, that never in ordinary life do you have that sense of being with a group of people who will die for you and you're ready to die for them. And also what a lot of people have said about war is you get this intensity of emotion and intensity of the experience. And this is something which is very difficult to discuss. But a number of people have tried to write about it. Svetlana Alexievich, the Belarusian writer who won the Nobel Prize, interviews people who talk about how everything in combat seems much more intense and the colors are brighter and life seems enormously precious because you know you're about to leave it. And so you do get, I think, among, at least not everyone, but there's certainly among those who fight, who talk about the attraction of war. And that's what makes the whole subject so interesting, because it is something we rightly regard as horrific, and we rightly regard it as a failure when countries go to war. But I think we have to remember, for those who fight it, there can be something about war that is enormously seductive. And I think we need to try and understand that.
Not to be too glib here, but I hear you, but can't you get the same feeling just winning the Stanley Cup or something like that, and it's a lot easier on your health?
Yeah, well, sport in some ways is a substitute for war among nations. I mean, the Olympics was set up, the modern Olympics was started before the First World War in order to bring the young people of the world together and not to have nationalism. And in fact, what they've become is highly competitive nationalistic things. But I suppose going into combat must be a bit like going off a ski jump, racing a very fast motorcycle. I've had soldiers actually say that to me, that they get the same thrill from going very, very fast, driving a car or on a motorcycle, because they know that they might die. And as one of them said to me once, that gives it an extra edge. I mean, these are things that I don't understand because I don't live in that world, but these are things that a lot of people have experienced.
Let me pursue that notion of putting one's life on the line. And I'll come at it from the back door here. We're going through a time right now in many Western nations where our origin stories and our historical figures are increasingly coming under historical review. They're now being seen as racists. They're now being seen as colonialists. What do you think that does to a population's willingness to enlist, serve, and potentially die for a country whose, pure white history isn't quite as pure and white as you thought?
It's a very good question. And I do think cultural factors have been and still are very important in whether people are willing or not to fight for their countries. I think that we've certainly seen societies in the past. Prussia, for example, in the 17th and 18th and 19th century was a country which valued war and honored those who were good at making war. And young men of the upper classes were brought up to be very brave, not to fear dying, and be prepared to go off and fight for their king if asked. And so I think, the ways in which people conceive of themselves and conceive of their countries can influence their willingness to fight. But what I find is interesting is we never quite will know how people will react if a war threatens. In the 1930s, in the United Kingdom, a lot of young people said, we'll never fight. We think the whole ruling establishment is corrupt, ineffective. We don't want to fight for this country. We don't want to go to war again. And yet when the acts of the Nazi and its Axis partners, when that menace became clear, those young people did go off and fight, and many of them volunteered. So I don't think we ever know entirely how we'll react. And I don't see anything wrong in a country discussing its own history and being aware of its own failings and being aware of the things that it's done wrong in the past. I think that could actually strengthen a country, that if you are prepared to look at your country's history and try and understand it and try and make things better. I think if you just give up and say, I live in a hopeless country, well, that obviously isn't going to make for a very united country. But if you say we're doing our best and we're going to try and mend things, that can actually be a very strong reason to feel an attachment to your country.
I wonder if we can talk about how the nature of war has changed in the intervening years. From this standpoint, clearly in World War I and World War II, there was no difficulty among any of the powers in killing as many non-combatant civilians as was possible to do. That seems to have changed nowadays. Certainly among Western powers, when Western powers go to war, they seem to try hard nowadays not to kill as many citizens as possible. Would you say that's fair?
I think that's true, but I think they're also trying very hard not to kill as many of their soldiers as possible. I think the sorts of losses that countries took in the First World War and the Second World War, we would find unimaginable today. We mourn every death in somewhere like Afghanistan, or the Americans mourn every death in somewhere like Iraq. And, we don't have those huge losses that they had in the First and Second World Wars. And I think you're right. I think we're also trying very hard not to kill civilians, but it hasn't prevented us, certainly hasn't prevented certain forces from the West in bombing villages by mistake, perhaps. An awful lot of civilians are still being killed. To our credit, I think, we deplore it. But we're still not sparing civilians when it goes to war. That awful expression, collateral damage, is about civilians getting killed, getting caught in the crossfire.
That collateral damage today, though, people may not know this. 50 million people died 75 years ago in World War II. 50 million people, maybe 80 million civilians. The numbers are, no one can be precise about that. Those numbers would be completely intolerable and unacceptable today in presumably any country in the world. What's changed?
Well, it's changed in some parts of the world. I think it's changed in the West. I think we're no longer prepared as societies to accept those sort of losses, and we no longer want to think of ourselves as being able to inflict them. But there are still parts of the world where an awful lot of people are dying in war. You think of the numbers who died in the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. Maybe 750,000 people died. We don't think enough about that because it's somewhere else and it's another part of the world. And an awful lot of people have died in the long-running wars in Africa, in the Middle East. And so I think it depends very much where you are, whether you have to confront the possibility of death in war and whether those casualties are acceptable or not.
No, that's a very fair point. And I think about Vimy, where we had 10,000 casualties over a few days in fighting 103 years ago on Vimy Ridge, and we had 150 dead fighting in Afghanistan. Now, I don't want to minimize the sacrifice of those 150, and their families and so on. But there's a difference between that and 10,000. And I almost don't even know what the question is here. But clearly we have a greater sensitivity to loss of any kind today that I wonder whether it makes war in some respects. Is it going to become obsolete at some point because the public is just not going to accept any loss of life at all?
I don't know. It's a very interesting question. I mean, I think we have changed significantly in Western societies, and we no longer are prepared as societies to contemplate the sort of losses that people were prepared to contemplate 100 or 150 years ago. Those are simply intolerable for us. And I think that is actually a very good thing. But that doesn't mean that we won't get involved in wars in the future. I mean, so often wars happen by accident. Or what we also have, I think, is a trend in making war now where we tend to rely on the technology. And so we imagine wars being fought increasingly by technology where we won't have to risk the lives of our military. So, for example, we will use drones, which don't involve human beings being present. I mean, they can be directed from a great distance away. Or we'll use artificial intelligence, or we will use cyber war. But there will still be parts of the world in which actual hand-to-hand, fist-to-fist, gun-to-gun combat will take place. And I think we should be careful to assume that we have become so nice and so gentle that we would never do that again. And societies change. And I don't want to be pessimistic, but, I look south of the border to the United States, and I find very alarming the presence and the appearance of increasing numbers of militia who dress themselves in what look like military uniform and carry guns. That is not a good sign, it seems to me. It doesn't seem to indicate that we are moving, or the United States is moving away from violence as a means of settling disputes.
I wonder if we should put these in two different buckets. So on the one hand, America clearly did, under George W. Bush's administration, it invaded Iraq. Under Ronald Reagan, they invaded Grenada. I mean, America does invade much smaller countries nowadays. But the notion of big powers going to war against each other, I mean, I well remember your book on how World War I started, and that was a superb book, and how so much of it started by accident, by fluke, by, in ways that no one wanted to see happen. But the notion of great powers going at it on a battlefield today, is that imaginable in your world?
Well, I hope not, but we still have in this world enormous military establishments. Now, they are called defense departments largely, but if you have a military establishment, in some way you are thinking about the possibility of war, and you have to make the plans. And we do have tensions in the world today. We have tensions between the United States and China. The United States has by far the biggest military in the world, but the Chinese have been spending enormously since about 2002 and building up their armed forces. We've had gunfire on the borders between India and China. And so the idea is that these great powers will never go to war with each other, I'd like to think is true, but they have the potential and they have the capability of going to war with each other. What always worries me is accidents happen. You will get an incident which will turn into a dangerous confrontation. And I worry about the escalation of rhetoric. I mean, I don't think we're going to have another war, but I think we ought not to be complacent about it. I think complacency actually can be dangerous.
Yeah, the world might also worry about hearing wolf cried one time too many. And again, you're quite right. We don't want to say that it's not going to happen. But I've been doing stories for 10 years and interviews on this program for 10 years with people who say war in the South China Sea among great powers is a matter of months away. Now, thank God it hasn't happened yet. But, I mean, how cocky do we want to get about this?
Well, I take your point, and we can be too alarmist, and I don't want to be alarmist because I think that it can create its own momentum and can, if you start to think a war is inevitable, then you start to act as if it's going to happen, and I think it makes it that much more likely. But I do find the present situation worrying. I mean, there is the way in which China has been asserting more and more what it calls its rights in the South China Sea, and the way in which it is now making threats about Taiwan, suggesting that it might be contemplating military action against Taiwan. These, I think, are more evident and perhaps more dangerous than they were 10 years ago.
Let's finish up on this, Professor MacMillan. Given all of your research and a look back at the nature of war over the last many centuries, is peace an aberration among us humans?
Well, sometimes I fear so. I mean, you think of how much war there has been in human society. It's hard to think of a century in which there hasn't been war, and it's hard to think of a time when there's not been war in some part of the world or other. And so it is, I think, it has been deeply intertwined in our society, but so has peace. And I think we have developed over the centuries and years ways perhaps of making peace, ways of trying to prevent war. And I think that's as important. I think that's what we need to try and do. And so, I'm not a warmonger. I don't want a war. But I do think we need to take it seriously and take its prospects seriously, because if we do that, then we have more hope of having peace, it seems to me.
That's Margaret MacMillan. She is the author of War, How Conflict Shaped Us. She's a professor of history at the University of Toronto and Oxford, where we have reached her tonight. Professor MacMillan, it's always great to have you on our program. You take care, and we'll talk to you again when the next book comes out, okay?
Thank you. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Coming up Monday on the agenda.
Most of the world's carbon emissions are in cities. And amongst the biggest cities of the world, there are real solutions happening today, not waiting for new inventions, but actually happening today, that if we did at scale quickly across most cities, we would get the world back on path by 2030 to do what's necessary. So from that perspective, the solutions are there. We just need to do them. And that's why I said the crisis can be solved in cities, because those solutions are there. We just need to do much, much more of it very quickly.
That's Monday on the agenda. In the post-World War II era, Canadian diplomat, foreign minister, and future Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in bringing about a multilateral peacekeeping force, the UN's so-called Blue Helmets. The style of international cooperation that emerged in a rules-based global order came to be a signature part of Canadian foreign relations and known as Pearsonian diplomacy. Well, we're a long way from that time and place. Is it also time then for Canada to take a different stance in the world? Let's find out as we introduce our guests from furthest away to closest to our studio, as is our custom. We start in Regina, Saskatchewan with Jennifer Welsh, Professor of Global Governance and Security and Director of McGill University's Centre for International Peace and Security Studies. In River Heights, Winnipeg, Manitoba, Lloyd Axworthy, former Foreign Minister of Canada, now Chair of the World Refugee and Migration Council. And in the Annex neighbourhood of Toronto, Ben Rosewell, former Canadian Ambassador to Venezuela and a diplomat in Afghanistan. He's now President of the Canadian International Council. And it's great to have you three on TVO tonight. Ben, I wonder if, just perhaps for those who are new to Canada or who are young and don't remember Mike Pearson, when we talk Pearsonian diplomacy, what do we mean?
Well, I do make a distinction between Pearson, the man, the diplomat, and Pearsonian tradition, which is a celebration of something that he did. And to give you an example of what that is, when you visit the headquarters of our Foreign Service in Ottawa, it's called the Pearson Building. You walk in, you turn to the left, there is a shrine with a gold medal. It's the Nobel Peace Prize that Lester Pearson won in 1957 for creating peacekeeping. At a time when Canada was searching for a new national identity, when we were dealing with a rise in Quebec separatism, we were breaking away from the UK, we were trying to negotiate a new relationship with the United States, that international accolades that came from that accomplishment in the international system gave Canadians great pride. I think we have been genuflecting at that altar, and I count myself as a former diplomat as part of that tradition, because the story that it helped us tell about who we are as Canadians has been a really central part of our foreign policy. And for many years that served us well. I think the world has changed and it no longer serves us well now.
Well, all right. Follow up then, if you would. Do you think it's time to bury Pearsonian diplomacy now?
I do, and I think the real the pin drop for me with our failed bid to win the Security Council just a few months ago. I can totally understand why Canada would want to pursue a seat on the Security Council. It's the top table of the multilateral system. It's the place where issues of war and peace get debated. Of course, that's where Canadians want to be. And yet most Canadians, I was surprised by their opposition, even their hostility to the fact that the government was pursuing this. And it occurred to me that there's been a dangerous gap that's emerged between what Canadian citizens feel about international relations, the level of fear that we have as the world has become much more dangerous. There's a growing disorder, and this continuing pursuit of a story that we like to tell about ourselves. And I think that gap is dangerous. We need to be much more assertive and ambitious in our foreign policy. We need our citizens to be on board. And so I think we need to get past this identity building or storytelling component of our foreign policy to confront the realities of today.
Well, just before I get Lloyd Axworthy to react to what you just said, Maybe we could do a little background first, Mr. Axworthy. You're the one among us here today who actually had a shot at knowing Mike Pearson. How old were you when you first heard him speak?
I was 17 years old, high school student in the north end of Winnipeg. And our history teacher, J.J. Phillips, terrific guy, said that we had to go down to the old auditorium downtown Winnipeg to listen to a politician. Some of us weren't too thrilled at the option, but he reminded us 25% of our marks were at stake. So we went down. And I got to tell you, Steve, it changed my life. It wasn't so much that he was talking about peacekeeping. He was talking about Canada and how we had a certain distinction based on our history, our culture, our geography that we had to follow. He talked about how there was the coming together of so many disparate groups from so many different countries that we began to learn how to get along. We learned something of the art and skill of mediation and negotiation and finding ways of compromise and accommodation. He also talked particularly, I guess, what attracted me as a young teenager, just beginning my educational career, that we could make a difference. That Canada had a certain distinction, and it wasn't just about peacekeeping. I go back to a point that Ben raised. If you look at Pearson's precedent, he was the chair of the original beginning of the Food and Agriculture Organization, worrying about food security. What's more relevant today than food security? He was very heavily involved in what was then called the United Nations Relief Rehabilitation Agency. And what was it dealing with? Displaced person, another fundamental issue of our time. He was also, as many of you know, very much involved in the creation of the United Nations, but on the basis that great powers shouldn't be totally capable of paralyzing institutions because of the veto. He fought against it, both at the San Francisco meetings and certainly during the discussion. So the Pearson tradition has a lot more sort of strands to it that have to be woven together. And I'm not saying that peacekeeping a la 1956 is our modality, but I am saying that the basic idea that we had to collaborate for Canada's best interest in terms of our strategic position as well as our values was to be in collaboration, cooperation with other groups, countries, and governments. And I think that's been still, a basic gold standard that Canada has to recognize.
Well, the current Prime Minister had something to say about all this at the United Nations not too long ago. Let's play a snippet of that, and then we'll come back and chat again. Sheldon, if you would, the clip.
In their era, those systems worked. But that was 50, 60, 70 years ago. Today, all those institutions no longer serve us well enough on what they were designed for: defending multilateralism and international law, protecting human rights and open markets. We are in deadlock. The international approach we've relied on since the second half of the 20th century was built on an understanding that countries would work together. But now those same countries are looking inward and are divided. We need to recognize where we are. The system is broken. The world is in crisis.
Well, Jennifer Welsh, the Prime Minister certainly seems to think that Pearsonian diplomacy may be in trouble right now. What's your view on whether the so-called rules-based international order still works?
Well, he's right in that a lot of these institutions are paralyzed by great power politics. You know, if you think about the UN Security Council as an example, it's not just the fact that it's failed to agree on effective action in Syria, but that with respect to an issue like the current pandemic, it took months for it to even be able to pass a resolution. But I do think we need to be careful about saying that the entire system has fallen apart. We have a number of institutions globally. Not all of them are at the global level. Some of them work at regional levels. And so what we need to be thinking about along the lines I think that Ben has suggested is where it makes most sense to solve the problems we face. And it may mean, Pearsonian diplomacy, if it were to be revived, it would be looking for creative new ways to cooperate. And I think that part of Pearson's agenda is very important. Much of what he did was in a context of rivalry between great powers that had made cooperation difficult, and trying to find a way through that path. I don't need to tell the members of this panel, that we face the same kind of rivalrous situation where the U.S.-China relationship infects almost every aspect of international relations today, whether it is the UN Security Council, whether it's trade, whether it's the digital world. So that part of Pearson's legacy, I don't think is dead. I do think the Canadian tendency to support institutions for the sake of institutions, that does have to be rethought. And we need to be much more clear-eyed about the kinds of institutions that either we want to build or that we want to invest in.
Well, Ben, I have heard you make the comparison between some of the international institutions today to the old League of Nations, which I presume is not a great comparison to make because that failed and no longer exists. So just put a little meat on that bone. What do you mean by that?
Well, the point I make is that the League of Nations continued to exist until 1946. Obviously, through the entire Second World War. I don't think many people knew that, but the diplomats would actually gather in the hall in Geneva and would pass resolutions, and the trappings of diplomacy would continue. Now, I'm not predicting that the UN is going to fail in the way that the League of Nations does, but I do think that the mechanics of diplomacy have a way of grinding on regardless of the substance that necessarily comes from that, and we tend, as Canadians, I think as Jennifer pointed out, we're institution builders, so we do value those institutions. But when the outcomes that are being negotiated are not having a tangible impact on our lives, we need to think about creating new institutions, about finding other ways to project our power. And I'd go, I think, a bit further than both of my co-panelists here in saying we probably need to add to our toolkit beyond collaboration and cooperation. That is very much part of the Pearsonian tradition and a proud one, and Canada's done very well. But in a world where it's marked by really serious conflict and disorder, I think we need to be able to confront and to compete as well as to collaborate. When you've got a rising great power that arrests our citizens with impunity and holds our economy hostage in order to exert political pressure on us, the desire is still for us to find ways to collaborate, and I can understand that. But I do think there's a recognition that China's affront to Canada will only be met when we're willing to collaborate with others that are willing to compete and to confront China. And that, I think, would be territory that Lester Pearson was very familiar with. This is the foreign minister that brought us into the Korean War to fight for the ideals of the United Nations against states that opposed them. This was a leader who also helped negotiate and create the North Atlantic Treaty and NATO. So there was a capacity to compete and to fight if necessary that Pearson exhibited, but that hasn't survived as part of the Pearsonian tradition with its focus really exclusively on cooperation. I think we need to relearn some of those habits of Canadian foreign policy in the past.
Let me get Lloyd Axworthy to respond to that. Do we need at this moment, given what our relationship with China is like, and given the kind of world we live in today, do we need a more, well, pick the word you like, a more muscular, a more power-grabbing, a more bellicose even foreign policy approach?
Well, to begin with, let's ask what that sort of muscle flexing has got us. It's put us in handcuffs when it comes to dealing with some of the real transgressions going on by China in terms of Hong Kong, human rights issues, its aggressiveness. But we put ourselves in a box because we haven't really used all the tools in the toolkit of diplomacy to find some way of accommodating, plus the fact that I think it was clearly a reaction to what has changed dramatically in our universe is the Trump illusions, and that we've had to buy into many of them, which we have done to keep the peace on the border and to get along with our neighbor south of us. But the reality is that in many ways, I would make a case quite the opposite, that it's probably even more necessary to have diplomacy at work And I just don't mean diplomacy in terms of people in striped pants meeting in quarters of chancery somewhere. I am talking about things like digital diplomacy, the ability to use the new technology to connect with people, citizens around the world. And I think the definition that's not being really addressed here is that part of the Canadian tradition, built on the Pearsonian foundation, was the protection of people, of civilians. And that is still, when we talk about conflict, it's not getting in to rub our elbows. It's beginning, how do you protect people right now who are starving in the Sahel? How do you protect people who are being displaced from the refugee camps in Greece? How do you protect people who are facing violations? The Yazidis, who we spent a lot of time with back in the 2019, but now they're trying to get back to their homeland, and they're being abused and violated and raped on the way back, and being faced up with passing through landmines. So, this whole idea that it's black or white, I think what you have to take is the values and the experience and lessons. But I think what we need to do as Canadians, we have to substantially reinforce and buttress our diplomatic, our security, our intelligence toolkit. And here's something, Steve, that I think, let's put this discussion on a different plane. It's not just kind of muscling in between China, U.S., Russian kind of games at the Security Council. We're now dealing with these existential risks. The epidemic itself has bared open so many of the inequities of the world. The hovering climate change impact is creating massive shifts in terms of migration of people. These are things that can only be answered internationally. They're not something that we can even sort of put together in a small kind of conclave. We have to get real cooperation going. And I think we're working at that. But I think that at the same time, we have to retain our independence. We have to retain our ability to make our decisions, not to simply follow the flag waving of another country, particularly a big country. I think that would be a serious mistake. And that, to me, is one of the prime lessons of the Pearsonian tradition, is how do we retain our ability as a country with the kind of richness we have, the education we have, the skilled people we have, to make sort of the important interventions, involvement. And let's not say that Pearsonian is just about diplomacy. I go back to when we were putting forward the human security policy, and we were faced with a choice of whether we would be prepared to join in a NATO force dealing with the ethnic cleansing and the genocide going on in Kosovo. And we put our men and women, it was the toughest decision I ever made as a foreign minister. But the reality is, it did stop the kind of wholesale transgressions and violations of the people in a small state. Those are the kinds of things that the toolkit is much broader than just people at Security Council meetings or in embassies. Although I would say this, unfortunately, and I think Ben would verify this, over the last couple of decades, including now, we are really sort of eviscerating our diplomatic capacity. We're not putting the resources to work to not only bolster what we can do, but we're cutting back on international development aid. We are not providing the kind of presence that we need in so many parts of the world. And one of the reasons why we didn't make the Security Council election is because we simply didn't have the kind of people out there on the ground working for us. We didn't have an agenda that said to the rest of the world, what are we going to do in the Security Council? How are we going to protect people? Whatever the agenda should be. And thirdly, our record in terms of our commitments on development aid and are one of the worst in the world, and even in the areas of human rights. I mean, there was a report just yesterday by Transparency that Canada has one of the worst records in prosecuting people who are money laundering in our country, who are bribing in the country. I mean, we've stepped back a lot from some of those basic values, and I'd like to see it restored to us. I don't mean we go back to 1956, but we go back to the ethos of that time, is that we have a role to play.
All right, I take your point on all that. I take your point, and certainly the need for cooperation. But I wonder, Jennifer, whether You know, we do hear more voices in Canada these days saying, okay, cooperation, fine, but this is a world today that's about naked power grabs. And Canada needs to express itself in a more powerful way if it intends to be a player in this kind of world. What do you think of that view?
Well, I do think that all states, not just Canada, have to, are faced with this challenge of a rivalry between two great powers, and also other states who are in relative decline and not coping with their relative decline. I'm thinking here of Russia. So it is absolutely clear we're in a phase of power transition. And history tells us that power transitions are very unstable. So all states need to be vigilant. They need to understand how power can be exercised. But I do agree that, thinking about our foreign policy as being power-based will look very different given the kind of state that we are. And I guess I'd make 2 points here. One of the claims I think that Ben is making is that it's dangerous for Canada right now to try to identity build through its foreign policy, right? That to kind of tell stories and try to build our own national identity through our foreign policy. And I'm in part agreement, but I would also say, let's expand our horizons. Many states try to craft their national identity through their foreign policy. Historically, the United States has tried to do that. But both of the countries that were competing with Canada for a Security Council seat do it in great measure. Norway has a national identity that is crafted through what it does in the world. Where I think Ben is right is to say, we can't do that on the cheap. If we are going to try to create a new and modern Canadian national identity through our foreign policy, we have to put our money where our mouth is. We have to really invest. If I take a country like Norway, which is much smaller than Canada, Canada is at many more top tables. It is very active in international mediation, and it has, as Mr. Axworthy will know, one of the most creative and active organizations on refugee issues, the Norwegian Refugee Council. So I do think when we think about power in the world, of course, we have to be paying attention to what the distribution of power is. We also have to be really realistic about what we can achieve. And where I think Ben has made an important point is that we do have to recognize who we can act with in different circumstances. I am one who believes that the fact that Canada is a liberal democratic state is not irrelevant to its foreign policy. It's difficult in our current world, given what's happening to democracy worldwide, but we have to, at relevant moments, stand with other liberal democracies and work with them constructively on issues that we care about, whether it is, as Mr. Axworthy has suggested, a protection agenda, which is not going away. If we look at the conflicts and the more competitive world that Ben is discussing, we know, for example, that civil conflicts are lasting on average longer today than they did 3 or 4 decades ago. That is an issue we can't run away from. And so what is Canada's approach going to be in a world in which we are going to have protracted civil conflicts, in which there is going to be migration, and there is going to be a protection agenda that still requires our investment?
Ben, maybe I could get you to pick up on that thread in as much as, do you think Canada should be pursuing a foreign policy that is focused on achieving more power?
I do, because I don't disagree with any of the aspirations, any of the goals to which we apply our foreign policy. But there has been a dramatic and growing gap between what we say we want to accomplish and what we actually accomplish. And I think that's because we're focusing on the ends and not the means. If we are more conscious of our own power, not just the power dynamics, which are changing dangerously and dramatically in the world, but think about what citizens need, how we have to change the outcomes that happen beyond our border if we're going to protect the prosperity of our citizens, the security of our citizens, now the health of our citizens in the face of very real global threats. We need to pay more attention to how we can accomplish those outcomes. A lot of that will be through cooperation, but not exclusively. We need to think about the capacities that we have. We need to invest far more. I certainly agree with Lloyd on that. We need to have a massive increase in our development assistance. We need to have a massive increase in our military and our expeditionary capacity, and sure, more diplomats and more embassies. But beyond that, I think we need to be able to think to engage in grand strategy, to consider what is it that we're trying to accomplish and how we're actually going to get there, so that we're focusing more on what we actually deliver for citizens than on the aspirations that we set.
Okay, Mr. Axworthy, I hate having to bring every discussion back to the guy who's in the White House right now, but the fact is, he is the most powerful person in the world, and I guess people are wondering right now that if he loses the next election, given the disruptive effect he's had on international relations and, frankly, on our ability to cooperate with the United States in doing things around the world, if Trump loses, do things go back to normal, quote unquote?
Well, I think, Steve, there's several scenarios that could build out. I mean, if Joe Biden wins in a very large way and there's a peaceful transfer, that's one scenario. What seems to be even increasingly more likely that Trump loses, but he doesn't go away. And he uses his kind of affiliations with all kinds of extremist groups to challenge the election and to throw the United States into a series of total confusion and chaos. And if Trump wins, well, that's Armageddon. That's a whole new story, and we better sort of start building a wall on our side of the border, because I think Trump has no rectitude at all in simply using his blustering and bullying to start demanding things of us as a Canadian. So that's why I say, I think to begin with, let's be careful about grand designs right now. I think we're navigating into a very unknown landscape. The kind of existential risks I just talked about earlier, I think are really the prime sort of focus, because they really risk humanity in a way. They're just not risking Canadians. And we have a role to play in trying to find some solutions to that. And the solutions aren't just, let's not talk about diplomacy. I've said this before. We're talking about it as if it's some kind of arcane, archaic kind of form of just discussion. But diplomacy now is a public diplomacy. You have to go out and change minds of people, including Canadians. Professor Welsh is talking about the domestic scene. The problem is we are not investing as a government, as a country, in getting Canadians more aware and conscious and agreeing on what it is that we want to do. How do we sort of assert ourselves both in a hard power, soft power way? By hard power, I mean, we do have a security issue of quite significant means, but sometimes it may be the way of delivering it is through a DART mission to Haiti when it had an earthquake, as opposed to sitting back and simply ignoring the kind of tragedy that takes place. We have to develop. Look, if I might give you an example. About 6 weeks ago, through our Refugee Migration Council, we partnered up with a group called the Independent Women's Refugee Network. We were in contact with 700 refugee women around the world to talk about how is COVID infecting them, what's happening to them, because they're at the back of the queue, and that was their concern. No government speaks for them, and there are many millions of people who, in this time of epidemic, don't have a voice as to who gets the vaccines or the remedies. That's a role that Canada should be playing, and I think we are. We're part of the COVAX coalition, but it's very minor in terms of the kind of effort and resources we're putting in. And so there's no question that it's a resource issue, but I think it also has to be directed to how we start rebuilding our own institution. We've watched a diminution of Parliament. I was an elected member for 27 years, and I keep looking and saying, where is the role of Parliament in defining where we're going in the world? We used the example when Bill Graham was the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. We did a major review of our nuclear position, which led to us taking a strong stand against the first use nuclear policy of NATO. That's the kind of role that I think is very much in the Pearsonian tradition, because there is no greater risk that we still face than the potential of a nuclear winter that could destroy the entire globe itself. So I think that before we get into these kinds of let's have another sort of grand design, let's do a little bit more careful navigating. I call it wayfaring, where you kind of you tack and fro according to the kind of handicaps and the problems you have, but you have a goal, which is to eventually come to the point where people are safe and secure. And that means Canadians. And Canadian security is going to be very much depend on the security of people around the world.
Okay, Ben, maybe you could wrap it up and put a bow on it for us. We've got 30 seconds left. Do you think the rules-based international order is salvageable?
It is, but I think we should take seriously the possibility that it no longer exists because we are so dependent on it for our security, for our prosperity, for our health, that if it does disappear, we're going to be in a real scramble. I would rather do that thinking before rather than after. I would like to already have a plan for what happens if Trump gets reelected. I think a wall is not going to be good enough. We can't be dependent on the United States. We need to be able to be independent of the U.S. So if we have 4 more years of a president who attacks the institutions and alliances on which we depend for our security, who calls us a threat to national security, that we're going to have other options, that requires thinking in power and thinking in strategy. And I think we owe it to Canadians to do that. Really good of all three of you to join us tonight on TVO. And, well, thank you, Jennifer Welch. Thank you, Ben Rosewell. And can I say to Lloyd Axworthy, if this is what 80 looks like right now, I'm not all that scared of the future as I might once have been. You are our third 80-plus former cabinet minister to be on the air this week, and well, good on you. There we go.
Steve, experience counts.
Amen to that. Thank you very much, you three. And that is the agenda for Thursday, October 15th, 2020. With less than 3 weeks to go in the most consequential U.S. election campaign in recent memory, tomorrow, artificial intelligence pollster Aaron Kelly will be here with word on what the AI Polly is picking up about possible outcomes. Also, a quick reminder, TVO's 50th anniversary telethon weekend is fast approaching. We'll be on air all day and all night with specials, world premieres, and gems from days gone by. So we hope you'll tune in anytime over the weekend. Yours truly kicks off Saturday evening at 6:30, so please stop by and see what we've got up our sleeves. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. And NAM, we'll see you here tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.